There is a version of your life you have imagined, not a fantasy version, not an unrealistic one, a version that feels true to what you were made for, a calling you can sense even when you cannot see it, a capacity you carry that hasn't yet found its moment. And then there is where you actually are. Maybe the gap between those two things has been weeks. Maybe it has been years. Maybe you've stopped counting because counting made it worse. Moses knew that gap. He knew it for 40 years. Moses was born into a death sentence. Pharaoh had ordered the killing of every Hebrew male infant. His mother hid him for 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a basket and set him in the reeds of the Nile. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the palace. By every external measure, the boy who should have died became one of the most educated, most powerful young men in Egypt. He had access to the best administrative training in the ancient world. He understood how the empire operated. He was, by the time he reached adulthood, the kind of person you would look at and say, that man is going to do something significant. And he knew it. Acts chapter 7 tells us that Moses, at the age of 40, supposed that his brothers would understand that God was using him to rescue them. He knew he was called. He could feel it. He was ready. At least he thought he was. What happened next ended everything. Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He looked both ways. He killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. The next day, when he tried to intervene in a fight between two Hebrew men, one of them looked at him and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" The thing he had tried to bury was already known. Pharaoh heard about it. Moses fled. In a single day, he lost his position, his identity, his safety, and his calling, or what he had assumed his calling required. He ended up in Midian. He sat down by a well. That image matters. The man who had been a prince of Egypt, sitting by a well in the wilderness, with nothing. No title, no plan, no next step. He helped Jethro's daughters water their flocks. He married Zipporah. He became a shepherd. And then, years passed, not months. Not a difficult season that resolved quickly. Years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years total, from the moment he fled Egypt to the moment the burning bush appeared. 40 years. We are not told how Moses spent his afternoons. The Bible doesn't describe what he was thinking when the decades stretched out and nothing changed. It doesn't tell us whether he still believed the calling was real. It gives us almost no detail about the Midian years, only that he was there, that he tended flocks, that he had a son, that life continued in its quiet, uncelebrated way. What the wilderness was doing, it was doing slowly. It was removing the Egyptian, not the education that would stay and prove useful, not the intelligence, not the administrative capacity, but the Egyptian prince who believed that the force of his own confidence and the weight of his own indignation would be sufficient to accomplish what God intended. That man needed to go. Moses at 40 was a man who trusted himself. Moses at 80 was a man who had run out of himself. And that is precisely the man God needed. When the burning bush appeared, Moses turned aside to look. He didn't run toward it. He turned aside. The word suggests a quiet curiosity, not a dramatic encounter. A man shaped by decades of attentiveness to small things, the movements of flocks, the sources of water, the shifts in weather across the wilderness, noticed something unusual and turned to look at it. And God spoke. What God said was not, "Moses, you've waited long enough, now it's your turn." What God said was, "I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their pain, and I am sending you." Moses' first response was not confidence. It was a question. Who am I? Not the question of a man who has given up. The question of a man who has been genuinely emptied of the certainty that used to live where that question now sits. The man who had assumed at 40 that his brothers would recognize God's hand in him, that man was gone. In his place was someone who no longer trusted the adequacy of his own presence, which made him, for the first time, usable. God's answer to Moses' question is the most important part of the exchange. He did not say, "You are a man of great education and experience. You are capable, and you have been prepared." He said, "I will be with you." The qualification for the assignment was not Moses. The qualification was God. And Moses could only receive that answer, could only function on the basis of that answer, because 40 years in the wilderness had burned away every other source of confidence he had ever carried. What was built in Midian? Endurance. The ability to lead in environments that offered nothing in return, no applause, no progress reports, no confirmation that the work mattered. Moses learned to tend things that couldn't thank him in terrain that didn't reward him for decades without visible result. Humility, not the performed kind, the kind that comes from having been a prince and becoming a shepherd and discovering that the shepherd is closer to the truth of things. Dependence, the specific, practiced dependence of a man who has stopped believing in the sufficiency of his own resources. These are not qualities that can be installed quickly. They require years, often decades, often exactly the kind of decades that feel from the inside like nothing is happening at all. This is what the delay actually is. Not punishment, not rejection, not evidence that the calling was wrong or the door is closed. Formation. The version of you that is needed for what you are called to, that version requires things that cannot be rushed. Character formed under pressure that only accumulates slowly. Dependence learned through the repeated experience of having nothing else to depend on. Humility built not by insight, but by years. Moses needed 40 years. You may need fewer, you may need more. But the shape of the process is the same. God does not delay success because he is withholding it. He delays it because the person who will carry it is still being built. You are not behind. You are in the part of the story that most people skip over when they tell it. But the burning bush doesn't mean anything without Midian. The parting of the sea doesn't happen without 40 years of a man learning what it means to have nothing but God. Your hidden season is not what stands between you and your purpose. It is what makes you capable of it.